You're listening to the Voice of Russia from the heart of London. On weekdays, we broadcast live from 4 p.m. until 8. We'll bring you news, current affairs, features and debate. You can listen to us on digital radio and online. Visit ruvr.co.uk.
Welcome back. You're listening to the Voice of Russia in London. I'm Brendan Cole. Now, the lightning that was photographed above St. Peter's Basilica on Monday night was an apt metaphor for what had happened a few hours earlier. The resignation as Pope of the man born Joseph Aloysius Ratzinger was indeed considered a bolt out of the blue. Yesterday, he held his last scheduled public mass for Ash Wednesday following his resignation. Benedict XVI anointed the foreheads of the faithful with ashes in a service attended by cardinals, bishops, monks, friars and pilgrims. Earlier, he had thanked the public for their love and prayers in his first public appearance since the resignation. You have to go back to Gregory XII more than 600 years ago for a pontiff to have stepped down voluntarily. Benedict stated that age was against him to continue the ministry as the head of the world's more than 1 billion Catholics. He was a man who used Twitter. He was the first pope to give a TV interview, but he endorsed the use of Old Rite Latin masses and very much maintained the status quo for the Catholic Church's position on various issues, including birth control and sexuality. But what kind of pope was he, and what was his legacy? What now for the Catholic Church, and who will take over? How will the Catholic Church function from now on in the 21st century? Well, to discuss this and the issues surrounding it, I'm joined in the studio by Peter D. Williams. He's a Catholic writer, and he's a speaker from the group Catholic Voices. We will be joined by our studios in Washington and Moscow a bit later on. Peter, first of all, a lot of popes have gone through infirmity, and why do you think infirmity or old age stopped this pope from continuing his ministry?
Well, I think possibly two reasons. First is the changing nature of the papacy. The fact that these days, particularly after Pope John Paul II, who was a very active pope, he did a lot of travelling. Now that's almost assumed that you will do. If you are pope, then it's not, you won't just stay in the Vatican and do things there. You will also go to various different countries. And we have a pope now who, particularly I think in the last few months, his health, his physical stamina has deteriorated to the extent that he didn't feel he could do that. And given that is such a part of the role now, he felt it was better for someone younger and more strong to be able to do that. I think the other reason is possibly, and this is just sheer speculation, but I think that he probably looked at the later pontificate of Pope John Paul II, and he saw how he mentally and physically deteriorated, and probably said, well, in many ways that was a wonderful witness, the fact that it witnessed to the dignity of infirmity and old age. But at the same time, it meant that many things that the church would be able to expect from their supreme pastor weren't being able to be fulfilled. And so I think in that sense, he thought, well, it would probably be better to have someone now who is younger, who can take this on.
And raising his predecessor, Pope John Paul II, you could argue, and many people would, was that he was a key political figure in the sense that he was very key in terms of the fall of communism. Yeah. He preached as the Berlin Wall was coming down. Even atheists acknowledged his significant role. He was a very charismatic figure. Ratzinger wasn't like that, though, was he?
Well, no, he didn't live in the same times as Pope John Paul II. And those were very tumultuous times, and we still have many things going on today. But I think this was a very different pope. This was a pope who was much more gentle, quiet, intellectual. I mean, both were intellectual popes, but this one in particular was one who focused very much on his teaching role, and I think reformed the church in ways that were different but very much complementary and progressive from Pope John Paul II. They fit together very well, and I think actually the next papacy will see the same thing. But this is an act, we have to remember, of just absolutely characteristic humility and wisdom from this pope.
Do you think that's how most Catholics will see it, though?
I think a lot of them, I think most do. I think to a great degree there was shock. We were all quite surprised that this hasn't happened for almost 600 years since Pope Gregory XII. But I think most people were quite surprised. Some would probably be somewhat disappointed in the Pope. Possibly they would have drawn a bad comparison with Pope John Paul II. But again, I think most of them now say, well, actually, in many ways, this is an incredibly wise decision and one of great humility. So I think that's what most people will be taking from this, and that won't stop them loving him anyway.
You did raise the point about him being a quiet man, and he's been praised certainly in the last few days, his role as a theologian, not just during the papacy, but also prior to that. But do you think that some in the church will actually be happy that he's leaving, that he hasn't quite fulfilled the expectations that they were hoping?
Well, it would depend on what their expectations were, I suppose, and I'd want to ask them what those were. In many ways, I think this has been a pope who has accomplished exactly, in many ways, in continuity with his role as Cardinal Ratzinger when he was head of the Congregation for the Doctrine of the Faith. The fact that he has reformed the Church's internal procedures to such an effective degree in dealing with the scourge of clerical abuse, which we now, of course, know is in all human institutions, but the Church can now lead the way in this in the way that it is certainly doing in England and Wales, and has done for the last 10 years. In making sure that the church is as safe a place as humanly possible. In fact, one of the safest places for children. That's one particular way. But the church also has a very important prophetic role. And this pope has been particularly important with regards to that.
I will touch on the controversies regarding abuse a bit later on, but just on this point of his tenure, which has been 7 years. I mean, when the last conclave, when the smoke raised and he was named pope, it did raise a few eyebrows, I suppose. He was 78 years old. Do you think he wanted the job? Do you think he was seen as a transitional pope? Do you think that the cardinals they viewed him as a transitional pope until, the next time around?
Well, that's huge speculation. We don't know. No one knows what happens in a conclave apart from the people who go in there. But ultimately, I don't know whether they saw him as a transitional pope, but I certainly think they did see him as a pope in continuity with Pope John Paul II. And as for whether or not he wanted the job, that he certainly didn't want the job. He wanted to retire. He wanted to go and have a much more academic, quiet retirement in which he could write books and study and think and pray and do all those things. I mean, he wanted to do that before John Paul II died. He actually asked the Pope at the time, please let me retire. And he said, no, actually, I still need you. So God has other plans. We make plans, but God has others. And they're much better ones.
But that surely should have counted against him in the choice of him. I mean, if he particularly wanted to see out the rest of his years as an academic, as somebody who wanted to write and contemplate and whatnot, he should have been allowed to do that.
Well, actually, I think quite the contrary. It's precisely the sort of person who doesn't want this job who should have this job. Because if you're the sort of person who is motivated by ambition, not that I think that very many cardinals are motivated necessarily by ambition, but if you are, then that makes you, I think, less worthy of the priesthood, worthy of the papacy, than someone who doesn't really want the job, but has the skill sets and has the wisdom and the experience and the humility to take on that role and allow the Holy Spirit to guide him in doing it effectively.
But in terms of, I suppose he has been criticised as being a conservative pope, but he's done really one of the most radical things a pope could do. He's quit.
Yes, very much. Well, it isn't without precedent, but it is, you're right, very, very surprising. In many ways, possibly, it might be the case that future popes might see this as a precedent that is positive and that they engage in, because, as I said before, because the papacy now involves so much travel, so much speaking, so much of as it were, a preaching role and a sort of a role of relationship with the people rather than just being far away, locked in the Vatican in an ivory tower. Because of that, I think actually future popes, if they do get to a point where they think, well, I literally can't do this anymore, they'll say, well, you know what, Pope Benedict XVI did it, I can do it too. And
so it's kind of setting a bit of a precedent that maybe wouldn't be particularly good for the papacy as a whole.
No, I think it would be very good. I think actually having that responsible outlook, saying, look, I'm not just going to do this till I drop. I have to think about whether or not I can do this well. And that's what God would want me to do. He would want me to do it well. Having that attitude, I think, is a wonderful precedent to set for future popes. And I'm very glad that this pope has done it. But we don't know how he feels. But I suspect he got to the point in the last few months where he said, if I do this any longer, I won't be doing my job. I will be betraying the trust of the church in the role that's been given to me. So,
well, for more on this, we're joined by our studio in Washington and our presenter there, Rob Sachs.
Thanks so much, Brendan. I want to welcome our guest, Father Thomas Reese. He's a senior fellow and director of the Religion and Public Policy Program at the Woodstock Theological Center at Georgetown University. Father Reese, welcome.
Thank you.
So listening to what we're hearing in London and some of the comments about the Pope stepping down, specifically on this question of setting a precedent. It's been 600 years since we've had a Pope do this, but now thinking about what it's like to run the papacy in the 21st century, could we see more popes in the future think this is the best way to go about it?
I think that's quite possible. I think it was inevitable that at some time during this century we have a pope resign, just as Pope Benedict did. The reason is modern medicine can keep the body alive long after a person is capable, both mentally and physically, of doing the job of being Pope. I mean, it's a tough job. And so as a result, I think I agree that he made a very wise decision in stepping down, a humble decision, recognizing that, for the good of the church, it was time for him to step aside. Now, I think that makes it much easier for an elderly pope, a sick pope, to do that again in the future. But then the additional question comes, well, if you can resign because of sickness, well, maybe you can resign because of other reasons. I think, for example, it may be possible that the College of Cardinals looks at the candidates and says, well, we could elect somebody younger because, they could voluntarily resign when they reach the age of 75 or 80. They don't have to stay in forever anymore. That could change the whole dynamic, because right now they're afraid of electing a young man as Pope, because he'll be in there for decades.
Well, to follow up on that, though, thinking about also what we heard of the demands of the Pope these days with the travel, with reaching out to Catholics all over the world, how can you find the balance of someone who is old enough to have that responsibility, but also has the vigor to have this travel schedule that can be very demanding?
That's exactly the problem that the cardinals face when they gather in the conclave, and that's what they're going to be thinking about. But the added possibility that the Pope can resign, I think, puts more weight towards a younger cardinal as a possible candidate. On the other hand, we're thinking in very Western terms. If you look at most of the rest of the world, outside of Europe and the United States, age is prized. Age is respected. And the old leaders aren't expected to resign. We look upon the Pope as the leader of a 1.2 billion member organization, and we ask ourselves, how could he possibly do it? Well, other places of the world, they say, no, we want wisdom. We want the elderly person. And he can have staff run around and do the other things that take a lot of energy. So there's cultural differences here. This is a universal church. This is one that is present in every part of the world, and we Westerners have to realize that other people have a different way of looking at this.
Well, with that, I want to bring in our Moscow guest, Ivor Makutzov. He is editor-in-chief of religio.ru. And wanted to ask you, a lot of speculation already about who the next pope will be and what region of the world this pope will be from. A lot of Catholics now live in Latin America. There is a significant portion in Africa. Do you think we'll see someone outside of Europe for the first time?
Hello, everybody. Actually, I'm not really one to take part in this gambling game, but what we can see that there are many people who mention that most likely it would be a person from, so to speak, all Europe. But still, I think that nowadays there is a strong tendency to find a person from so-called third world in order to bring a new stream, so to speak, in this field. Because as we may see, and what actually the present Pope mentioned, that the world is changing so fast that the Catholic Church need to find new solutions, new ways, new paths. So it should be a person with a good background of reforms, who made some reforms in his own church, who find somehow solutions to these new questions and new challenges. So, and it might be a person from the third world, and it might be also a person from the Latin America, as long as it's the most intriguing place where Catholicism take a very, very strong place. And it means that, but unfortunately, as far as I see, we will find a person from the old Europe, which will mean that Church rather wants to take a conservative position and wants still find a new, what you call transitional Pope. And if a new Pope would be from the third world and would be a young person with a good background of reforms in his own place, then it means that Church is ready to find solutions to these challenges of the new century. But most likely we'll find a very conservative person, or rather a person who can bring together different positions in the Church now. So it would be still a traditional Pope, as far as I see. But still, I don't really think that this gambling game now is really interesting.
Okay, I'd like to turn that to Peter Williams from Catholic Voices here. Actually, I mean, the outgoing Pope, he visited Africa. He's promoted African cardinals, and a lot of money is on, the smart money is going to be on an African cardinal, perhaps someone like Peter Turkson or whatever. I'm not going to ask you to make a prediction, but given that the number of Catholics, say, in Africa has risen so much, and there's a predominance of Catholics outside of Europe, do you think that the choice of the next Pope will have to reflect the changing congregation of Catholicism?
I'm not quite sure that will be the priority of the cardinals when they're considering who the next pope will be. The point of the papacy is not to be a representative role. The point of the papacy is to have a teaching role, to have an authoritative role. And so, I mean, I'm not going to make any guesses as to whom the next pope will be either. But if it were someone from Africa like Peter Turkson, or someone from Latin America like Archbishop Norberto Carrera, or Cardinal Carrera, who has fought very valiantly against corruption in Mexico City, that would be a very good thing in many ways for the public image of the Church, for the emphasis of the Church in its role in third world countries. But at the same time, I actually don't necessarily think that's something that the cardinals are particularly concerned about. I think what they're concerned about is having someone who has the wisdom to take on the role, who will continue the good work done by the last two popes. So in many ways, I have no idea who the next pope will be, and I don't think anyone can tell, going by factors like whether or not they're from the third world or whether or not they have a particular record. But I mean, yeah.
But they will be taking on those concerns, certainly the concerns of the social concerns, for instance, of the third world, in a way that you could argue that somebody from Italy or Germany in the previous case just wouldn't have experience of. That would be a significant life experience to bring to the papacy, wouldn't it?
It possibly would be. I think also we have to remember that the Pope is informed by all sorts of different congregations, all different kinds of institutions within the Vatican itself, on science, on third world development, on aid, on social justice, on peace, on the foreign situation in the world. He's a very, very, very well prepared person. And no matter who is the next Pope, they will have the access of all those resources given them by the wealth of knowledge of the universal Church. So I don't think that you need to have someone who has been in a situation to necessarily have a wise policy on it. I think you just need someone who has the prudence and the wisdom and the personal character to make sure that the right decisions are made.
But the criticism of the last pope is that he was out of step with the laity in a number of issues, and a lot of the laity simply ignored what the church hierarchy had to say about issues such as contraception and stuff. You could name your topic, I guess, but this has got to be a cause for concern, doesn't it?
Well, certainly I think the cause for concern in the Church is not whether or not it's out of step with the laity. Rather, the laity need to be always in step with the teachings of the Gospel. And if the laity aren't in touch with the teachings of the Gospel, that speaks of a lack of evangelization, a fact that the laity, those laity who do reject the Church's teaching on, say, contraception, have clearly not been properly evangelized, and certainly they've been very poorly catechized, because there are wonderful reasons for why the Church has its positions on sexual ethics. And actually, the alternative that the Church offers people to artificial contraception, natural fertility awareness, is actually incredibly not only effective, but totally in keeping with the values of the Gospel. So if those people don't know that, and I suspect the vast majority of Catholics don't know that teaching, that speaks of a thorough lack of catechesis within the Church, by which we mean teaching, the teaching of the doctrine of the Church to the lay members.
Sure, forgive me for interrupting, but people who I'll take this issue of contraception, and I think obviously it's an easy target, I suppose, for critics of the Catholic Church, and I acknowledge that. But the point is that the idea that in Africa, for instance, and we've been talking about the potential of an African Pope, whether that will happen or not, we don't know. But that the issue of AIDS ravaging Africa and yet using a condom is a sin.
Mm.
That's out of keeping with life in the 21st century, isn't it? And that's something people aren't anticipating the Catholic Church to necessarily change their stance on that, but they do have to understand that the pressures of the 21st century do differ from the last century.
Well, actually, there are perennial moral principles which don't change from century to century. We have this idea of this continual moral progress of humanity. Actually, in many ways, we haven't progressed. And actually, there's no necessary reason for thinking that one century is better than another simply because it's forward in time. But the Church is always informed, as I said earlier, by the expertise of various different Catholic experts from around the world, by the different congregations. And actually, when we look at the issue of HIV prevention policy, the Church isn't just saying, oh, well, stuff whether or not this is effective, we're going to hold to our dogma regardless. The Church is actually saying, look, when we actually look, for example, at the distribution of condoms, the proliferation of condoms as prophylactics, not as contraceptives, but as prophylactics throughout the third world, what we don't find is that this is improving the situation. We actually find it's making the situation worse. That's not because condoms in and of themselves don't, on an individual sex act, reduce your possibility of getting HIV if you're having sex with an HIV-infected person. It's actually 80% effective in reducing that risk. But when it comes to small-scale populations, when it comes to large-scale populations, there's a difference. So when you come to large-scale populations, what we find when you distribute condoms is that people engage in what's known as risk compensatory behaviour. So when you give someone a risk reduction technology, whether it be a condom or even if it's something else, actually like a seatbelt when you're driving a car, instead of actually acting in a more safe way, they actually tend to end up acting in a more risky way. That's what's known as risk compensatory behaviour. Great, I've got this risk reduction technology. Now I can do more what I like. That's actually what the medical, anthropological, and epidemiological evidence shows us. If you read people like Edward C. Green from the University of Harvard, he actually showed very, very clearly in his various books that this is exactly what happens. That HIV prevention is not helped by distributing condoms in places like Africa. Rather, it's actually behavioural modification policies, which is exactly what did work in Uganda. So quite far from the Church being out of step with the evidence, out of step with the 21st century, it's actually got the most progressive and helpful policies for reducing HIV in Africa.
I think that one of the things we should remember is that this is an issue that's been discussed inside the Vatican behind closed doors for quite a while. Even the Pope himself has made some progressive statements on this when he said that the use of condoms by gay prostitutes was quite appropriate.
Well, he didn't actually say that.
You hear people like Walter Kasper say that his argument, frankly, is that anyone who has AIDS who does not use a condom is committing a sin against the fifth commandment, thou shalt not kill. So you're committing two sins, one against the sixth commandment of having sex outside of marriage, and the second by putting someone's life in danger. So this is an area where I think we have to rely on medical science. And in most places, the judgment is that the ABC method of abstinence first, use a condom if you're not going to be abstinent, and be faithful to one partner. That is the method that's been shown to be the most useful in reducing the spread of AIDS. There's no question that abstinence is the best way, and it's the way that the Church would prefer. But if people can't accept our teaching on abstinence, then we have to, make sure that they don't kill each other and to do whatever is possible.
Well, Father Reese,
let me get back to the question of geography, because I think that's very interesting. I think that, there's two views on this. One is that the Church is growing and doing well in Africa, and therefore we should look to Africa for a pope. The other view, though, is the Church is doing terribly in Europe, and we need somebody who can fix it. We need somebody who can understand that the job of the church and the Pope is to figure out how to preach the gospel in a way that is understandable and attractive to people in the 21st century. We can't just quote from people in the 13th century. We have to do what Augustine and Aquinas did. We have to take the best of intellectual thought that we have in our time. Augustine did that with Neoplatonism. Aquinas did it with Aristotle, and used those new modern ways of thinking in their time to explain the gospel to their generation. We have to do that today. So that is one of the challenges. The other point I would make is, I'm afraid one of your speakers had the false idea that if you got someone from the third world, you would get a liberal. I mean, all you have to do is look at the Anglican Communion and know that it doesn't work that way. When it comes to social issues, the role of women in the church, the role of gays, etc., the third world bishops can be even more conservative than the bishops from the first world. Where you do see more progressive views is on issues of, say, capitalism, of economics, where they see that capitalism is exploiting people in the third world because they see their people as starving under this system. But, even there, I mean, frankly, Pope Benedict has been more radical and liberal on economic issues than most of the politicians in the United States and Europe.
So I'll actually bring in our guest in Moscow, Ivor Makutzov, who's editor-in-chief of religio.ru. In your view, Ivor, do you think, in terms of some of the positive things that perhaps the Pope has not been recognised for, he has been very critical of global capitalism. He's been he's opposed war, current world conflicts, especially the war in Iraq. Do you think these kinds of issues have taken a bit of a back seat in terms of how people remember the Pope?
No, I don't really think so, but I think it would be rather remembered as a person who didn't solve many issues and many questions which were raised by the new generation. And that's not only contraception and the question of using condoms, the variety of questions with the sexual ethics, it's LGBT problems and various issues there. There are still problems with this gay attitude and gay marriage things, and there's still a question of could priests get married or not, and there are also question of ecumenical dialogue. There's still a question, from my point of view, from Moscow, relation with the Russian Orthodox Church and so on, and there is also a question which hasn't been solved. While we thought that he is a brilliant theologian, and we think that he is a brilliant theologian, and it seems some years ago when he got to papacy that he would solve it, or at least put forward these questions. But while being put forward by another theologians and other people, he didn't try, as far as I see, he didn't try to solve it really. And then it still seems like a transitional pope in that point of view.
But
so that's the
on that aspect, on the aspect of interfaith understanding, it could be said, that the Pope, he did spark outrage in some Muslim circles in 2006 when he quoted from a 14th century Byzantine emperor who labelled the Prophet Muhammad evil and inhuman. But however, there has been successful Muslim-Christian dialogue, hasn't there? And also his papacy has been characterised by what the chief rabbi of Israel has said has been warm relations between Judaism and Catholicism. So there have been some quite positive interfaith benefits from this papacy, haven't there?
Yeah, probably. We can see some positive tendency, but still there are such an important issues which raised in different parts of the world with this inter-religious dialogue, and also with the rise of fundamentalism. And this rise of fundamentalism needs to find a new way of answering from the Christianity all over the world. There is still a question for Russian Orthodox Church. It's a question for Catholic churches. There's also a question to different Protestant churches, and this way to answer and way to talk to fundamentalist groups. There is no solution nowadays. And unfortunately, for these last 10 years, we saw and we see now rise of fundamentalism, and it should be a very strict answer and very strict solution to this problem, but we haven't saw it, unfortunately, from the Pope. And the way when you try to speak with this, when different religious groups try to speak, that's okay, that's good, that's right, but still there is a very huge problem, and it should be started very carefully by the religious organizations, especially by the largest Christian confession.
Just quickly, Peter Williams, your response to some of the things that perhaps haven't been in the media in the last few days, of some of the comments and the strength of his convictions over things such as over rampant capitalism, ecology, the environment, war, those kinds of things. He's not really going to be remembered for that, is he?
Well, sadly not. I mean, I think. I hope that he will be in the future. If anyone reads any of his encyclicals, whether it be Deus Caritas Est, whether it be Spe Salvi, or whether it be Caritas in Veritate, particularly Caritas in Veritate, he speaks very, very strongly about unregulated capitalism, but also very much that caritas, charity, love, as in gratuitous love, needs to be shown in the market, in the state, in civil society. And he hasn't been silent on those social issues at all. He's very much dealt with them. I'm not quite sure how Ivor thinks that the Church could have dealt or can deal with fundamentalism. It itself is not fundamentalist, and it can. And very clearly in Caritas in Veritate, the Pope did say that both fundamentalism and secularism are deeply unhelpful to human dialogue, particularly interreligious dialogue, which he has worked very hard to actually further. I mean, I have to make two corrections actually about what has been said so far. With regards to his speech in Regensburg, he did not simply quote that source in some way of insulting Islam. He simply quoted one particular approach to religion, which he was problematizing and sort of criticizing, which is fundamentalism. Not Islam per se, but fundamentalism. And the second thing also is Father Reese's comment about the Pope's view on condoms. He didn't actually say that it was right for a male prostitute to use condoms, but rather that showed, if a male prostitute did use a condom, that showed a betterment of his moral understanding. But in many ways, this is a Pope who has been classically misquoted time and time again. I hope that in his retirement, what will happen is there'll be a more sober reflection, what he genuinely said in these instances, and the deep depth of wisdom in what he was saying.
Well, I'll turn to Rob Sachs in our Washington studio.
Thanks so much, Brendan. And wanted to pose some more questions to Father Thomas Reese from Georgetown about the rifts that the current Pope, Pope Benedict, has had with American nuns. Many have felt put out by him and have felt that there has been a very public rift between the two. Wanted to see, from the American perspective, what nuns are looking for, what American Catholics are looking for from the new Pope, and how they're viewing the legacy of Pope Benedict.
Well, I think it's quite clear that for the Pope, his role as a teacher is the most important part of his legacy. I mean, he was a German university professor before he became a bishop. He has always stressed the role of the Pope as a teacher. Now, the other side of that, however, is the problem that arises when there are people in the Church who disagree with what he's saying in terms of his teaching. And we know for a fact that there are many theologians, many priests, many religious, and many lay people who disagree with some of the things he has said. And that's where the problem comes in with both the nuns and theologians. And we have seen this since the beginning of John Paul II's papacy, where the Vatican has gone after these people, tried to silence them, and reprimanded them. And this is what we see happening with the nuns. The nuns have some progressive views about the role of women in the Church. They like to have an open discussion, open debate about some of these issues, open conversation. For the Vatican, there is no room for open conversation on issues that they think are closed. And so we have this tension between what is coming out of the Vatican and what many theologians and many priests and religious women and even lay people think. And
well,
that, I think, is at the heart of the problem here.
The other part of the problem that a lot of Americans are looking at is this whole child sex abuse scandal. We're seeing even in recent weeks, what happened in Los Angeles unfolding even more, and that there might have been direct correspondence. It looks like there was direct correspondence with the Vatican about shuffling pedophiles around to different areas to try to elude the law or things like that. This is a huge scandal that does not seem to be going away anytime soon. How will the next pope need to address this?
Well, I think that first and foremost, we have to say that this sex abuse crisis has been an absolute disaster for the church, and first of all, for the victims. I mean, we need to get down on our knees and apologize, and ask forgiveness for what happened to these children. But, first of all, this is a responsibility of the local bishop. The Pope is not the personnel director of the Catholic Church. It's each local bishop who is responsible for his priests, and the buck stops there primarily. Now, when we look at the role of Cardinal Ratzinger and Pope Benedict in this, I think we have to acknowledge that, at the beginning of his career as a bishop and in the Vatican, he did not understand this crisis. But he learned, he grew in his understanding of it, and he listened to people who came to him and talked to him about this. And as a result, he learned faster and he did better than anybody else in Rome on this issue, including Pope John Paul II. So that by the end of his papacy, Pope Benedict's papacy, the church is in a much better situation than it was at the beginning of the papacy of John Paul II. And I think we have to take that into perspective. Was he perfect from the very beginning? No. But is the church in a much better position today? Absolutely.
Can I put that point to Peter Williams here from Catholic Voices? A lot of people would dispute that Pope Benedict was listening to people about this. Okay, he presided over a very significant tragedy for the church that they had to deal with. But in the 1980s, in the early 1980s, he was in a position where he could have shopped priests. He could have. He was told, and he was given considerable evidence as to misdemeanors and sexual abuse cases involving priests, and he did nothing. Well, and that's how people perceive him.
Well, that's a wrong perception. When we actually look at the facts about what Pope Benedict did when he was Cardinal Ratzinger, before he became a cardinal, actually, and when he became Pope, what we see is a continual and progressive attempt to stamp out what he called the filth of sexual abuse. I mean, actually, in the early 80s, he was Archbishop of Munich and Freising. But when he became cardinal, and then when he became prefect of the Congregation of the Doctrine of the Faith, he wasn't immediately given responsibility for these kind of things. It was only when he became responsible for this, I think in the 90s, that he actually was made aware of all these ridiculous cases, all these disgusting actions. And every Catholic, by the way, has to acknowledge first and foremost that this is a despicable act, and we're very thankful to the media who have pointed this out to us, and the Church has been able to reform itself along those lines, in many ways quicker than many parts of secular society in doing so. But what Cardinal Ratzinger, when he was Cardinal Ratzinger, did is he made sure very, very clearly to stamp this out. He took a very hard line on it. He, in 2001, brought forward Sacramentorum Sanctitatis Tutela, which was a motu proprio, and which actually dealt with this by strengthening the Church's internal procedures, by making sure that the statute of limitations was extended so that crimes like this could be dealt with even though the statute of limitations had been run out, so that bishops, when in 2010 we became Pope Benedict, he increased this even more, and he actually made sure that procedures could be such that if a bishop has good evidence that a priest who has engaged in any of these despicable crimes, he can actually defrock him just like that. So actually this Pope has continually, over years and years and years, made the Church even better at stamping out this kind of abuse. But he's done brilliantly in doing so.
Really? I mean, isn't this the problem, that the whole Catholic Church is tarnished by this? The sheer hierarchical nature of the Church means that okay, you can dispute whether or not he acted tardily or quickly when he knew about the allegations. But the whole church, the hierarchy, the function of the church is tarnished with this irrevocably.
I don't think irrevocably. I think that certainly there were certain elements within the hierarchy who engaged in this despicable behaviour, but they are a tiny minority of the hierarchy. The vast majority of priests, the vast majority of bishops have never engaged in either a cover-up of abuse or abuse itself, and that needs to be remembered. When we look at Cardinal Ratzinger, we see what he did. He didn't act hardly. He acted very strongly, very quickly, and very consistently, and even more so when he became Pope as well. So we don't. Well, actually, I think when anyone who is interested in looking at the facts rather than the moral panic that surrounded this issue in the Western media, when they actually look at the facts, what we find is a church, and particularly a pope, who is engaged in the utmost reform and utmost seriousness when it comes to dealing with this kind of behaviour. And now actually in England and Wales, as I said earlier on before, we actually lead the way in terms of child protection policy. We're better than a lot of secular institutions. And having experienced now that not just the church but also the BBC and the NHS have had abuse crises of their own, we now see that the church has been particularly exposed due to this because it has a very high moral platform, a very high moral status, but it has by no means been the worst offender in this way. So actually I think what we see is this is an issue which has been blown very much out of proportion by a lot of people, but even where it's been the most serious, the church in most places, and certainly at the point of the Vatican, has dealt very appropriately with it and will deal with it more. And I actually think that this next papacy will just see a continuation of the very appropriate policies put forward by Pope Benedict himself.
Well, sadly, we've run out of time. There's obviously a lot more we could have discussed, but we'll be obviously clear. The new Pope is said to be named before Easter. That's what we've been told. What happens, who the name will be once the smoke rises after the conclave decide will be very much speculated in the media in the coming weeks, obviously, and will have significant consequences, and we'll be following the story very carefully. I'd just like to thank my guest here in the studio, Peter D. Williams from the group Catholic Voices. Thank you very much. And on the line in Moscow, Ivor Makutzov, who's editor-in-chief of religio.ru. And in the US, with Rob Sachs, on the line is Father Thomas Reese, who is a senior fellow and director of the Religion and Public Policy Program at the Woodstock Theological Centre at Georgetown University